Hello and welcome to another episode of Sermon Braindump. My name is Scott Dalen. I'm an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I present these videos every week for a couple of different reasons. The first of which is this is what happens when I freak out, and my brain goes numb. I should edit that out. You know what? This week I'm not going to. So two reasons that I do these videos. The first of which is just to take my brain out of the background work or mode of background work over the course of the week and move into the process of actually writing and preparing a sermon that I'll preach to my congregation for the weekend. That's the first reason. And the second is just to allow you, the viewer who have come across this video for whatever brought you here today, to gain some different insight into the assigned text for the week. So that's why I do these. This particular Sunday, which is October 1st, 2017, the 17th Sunday after Pentecost, and welcome to October, holy smokestack. Our gospel lesson comes out of Matthew chapter 21, verses 23 through 32. Now, this is a little bit of a jump from where we have been previously. The last few weeks, we've kind of found ourselves in the overarching narrative in a portion when Jesus is on his way towards Jerusalem. Now, church year stuff, we're starting to get a little kooky here, but this does kind of happen. And in fact, today we're actually jumping forward and Jesus in Jerusalem. Now, we usually think of things like the triumphal entry, which happens right at the beginning of chapter 21. And then all the subsequent things that are happening while Jesus is in Jerusalem as occurring during Holy Week, and Holy Week, of course, leading into Easter, which happened all the way back last spring. And so we're a ways away from that now, and yet that's kind of the narrative of where we have, or where we're finding ourselves this particular week. So the setting, we'll hear that Jesus goes into the temple, and the things that have happened through chapter 21, the first part of this coming into this portion. So there's been the triumphal entry when Jesus came into Jerusalem and the crowds all gathered and like, yay, hallelujah, Hosanna to the Son of David, all of that stuff. So that has happened. And then immediately upon his arrival, he goes into the temple, and it's the cleansing of the temple. So, he goes and he sees all the money changers and all the people who are selling livestock and all the stuff that's intended actually to help to help the Jewish people do their faith right, but has been twisted out of greed and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So Jesus witnesses, it gets all ticked off. Angry Jesus, I've talked about before. He starts throwing tables over, and he makes a whip, and he starts driving people out of the temple. And he says, "You brood of vipers." That's John the Baptist. He says, how dare you turn my father's house into a marketplace? So that has happened. And then there's been some back and forth over the course of this week. Jesus continues to go in and out of the city. He actually stays in Bethany, which is a village just a couple miles away. It's where Lazarus lives, and Mary and Martha, which are familiar names. But he's gone back and forth. There's a whole issue with a fig tree that he's hungry and he wants figs, but it's the wrong time of year because it's early spring, so there's not going to be any fruit on there. And so he curses the fig tree and it dies. And so that has happened. It's kind of an odd little chapter of things that are happening, but all of that's been going on, and that brings us to where we're at now. So it's important that we take all of this kind of together. This is a kind of a lengthy portion of Matthew's gospel. It's a couple of chapters long, and it really is kind of one big continuous story, that there's this ongoing tension and back and forth and questions of authority and questions of who are you to do this and say these things. So all of that is kind of happening, and this is just one portion. So I want to share that with you. We've got the question of authority that's going to go on. You'll hear that in just a second when I read it. And then there's this little, I call it a micro parable. Usually the shorter ones, I call them that. That's just what I call them. But that's coming up, the micro parable of the father who sent his sons into the vineyard, and their various responses. And there's also talk about John the Baptist. I had that in my head. That's why I talked about John here a second ago. So that's kind of where we're at in terms of today's setting and today's story. And it's a smaller part of a larger whole. And that's just important to know. So now let's dive in. Again, Matthew 21, 23 through 32. When he, being Jesus, entered the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him as he was teaching and said, "By what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority?" Jesus said to them, "I will also ask you one question, and if you tell me the answer, then I also will tell you by what authority I do these things. Did the baptism of John come from heaven, or was it of human origin?" And they argued with one another. "If we say from heaven, he will say to us, 'Why then did you not believe him?' But if we say of human origin, we are afraid of the crowd. for all regard John as a prophet. So they answered Jesus, "We do not know." And he said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things. What do you think? A man had 2 sons. He went to the first and said, 'Son, go to work in the vineyard today.' He answered, 'I will not.' But later he changed his mind and went. The father went to the second and did the same, or said the same. And he answered, 'I go, sir,' but he did not go. Which of the 2 did the will of his father?" They said, "The first." Jesus said to them, "Truly I tell you, the tax collectors and the prostitutes are going into the kingdom of heaven ahead of you. For John came to you in the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him. But the tax collectors and the prostitutes believed him. And even after you saw it, you did not change your minds and believe him." All right, so that's the whole thing. Again, we've got the bookends of the question of authority, and that they're pressuring Jesus, the religious elite is what I tend to call them. Now we've got the chief priests and the elders of the people, and it's interesting when we consider who these people would be, and if this was Jesus' day, I would be one of them. They're the educated, they're the scholarly, they're the people who kind of are in charge of the upkeep of the temple, and also are the ones who are the experts in the interpretation of the Torah and of the law and of the old, what we call the Old Testament scriptures, but the Jewish scriptures. And so they're the pros, and they're challenging Jesus. They're saying, by what authority are you saying all these things? By what authority are you doing these things? And for them, the question of authority really came down oftentimes in terms of a rabbi, which is what Jesus was considered to be. The authority of a rabbi would be passed on from a previous rabbi. And there's some, what's the word I'm looking for? I want to use the word ritual. I don't know if that's quite right, but essentially it's the authority of one is passed to the next. And it's only through a lot of study, a lot of time, a lot of apprenticeship that the authority would be granted to a person. So when they come to him, that's kind of what they're saying. It's like, you don't have a rabbi who taught you, so where's your authority coming from? And it's a challenge in terms of credibility. And they're trying to discredit him in front of the crowds, because all too often he is challenging them and challenging their status quo. Jesus challenged a lot, and so they want to discredit him, and they're doing so by saying, you have no authority. Where's your authority come from? So who are you to be teaching? Who are you to be questioning the way things go? It's really kind of the big thing that's going on there. It's a question of credibility. Now, of course, Jesus' credibility or his authority comes from God. He's empowered by the Holy Spirit. He's Jesus, who is God the Son. His authority is given to him from God on high. We have seen that repeatedly through Matthew's gospel in many different instances, including, though not limited to, his baptism, as well as the transfiguration, when we hear the voice of God and we see the Holy Spirit come upon him in the baptism, not in the transfiguration. But these things have already happened. And so we know that, especially we as readers of the gospel know that. But they're questioning him in front of the crowds to try and get him shunted aside, because if you can discredit him, just like we see in this day and age, particularly in the political political spectrum, that if you can discredit your opponent, that makes you look better, and that's what they're trying to do. So he twisted on themselves. And I love how Jesus does this, that he oftentimes answers a question by asking another question. Now, this was very common. It was a common form of rabbinical teaching, teaching of rabbis, in Jesus' time, that to ask a question, to pose a question to answer another. Gosh, I can't talk today. When you're asked a question, that you pose a question back to them. And it's very much a back and forth. And for Jesus in his time, this is very important. And we'll see that a lot when he constantly asks questions of people who question him, of what do you hear? Or how do you understand this? Or what do you read? And here it's well, I will ask another question. And if you tell me, I'll tell you where my authority comes from. Now, it's kind of an odd little thing, his little foray into John the Baptist, but John attracted crowds. John was considered to be a prophet. We hear that in the story, that he asked the big wigs, he's like, well, where did his baptism come from? And they're like, they kind of know, well, they're like, okay, so it's either from heaven or it's of human origin. And if we say that John pretty much came up with on his own, they're going to stone us, although that isn't here, that's in Luke. That they regard him as the crowds regard him as a prophet. We're scared of the crowds, and Luke says they'll stone us. But they said if it's from heaven and we recognize that, then Jesus will ask us, well, then why didn't you believe it? And from there we shift over into this micro parable. And I've got a lot of different thoughts about this micro parable. It's short, it's very brief, it's more just like an illustration. But so Jesus says there's a father and he tells his two sons, hey, go to work in the vineyard. The vineyard, side note, is a very common illustration for either the world or oftentimes just the kingdom of Israel, the people of Israel. So, but go work in the vineyard. And one of them says no, but he goes anyway. And the other one says, okay, and he doesn't go. And there's the question of which one did the will of the Father. Well, now they answer Jesus, the first guy, and there's credence to that because his actions do indicate that he listened to his Father. He did what was asked of him, even if he told them no. And that seems to be the point that Jesus is trying to make here, because then he shifts over and he starts talking about how the tax collectors and the prostitutes, the people who shouldn't get it, the people who should not be worthy of hearing this message and believing it, the people who should not be worthy of God's grace and favor and mercy, however you want to say it, they get it. They listened. At first, their lifestyle, whatever you want to say, and that sounds really judgmental. I don't even like how that's sounding coming out, but their life to this point has said no, and yet they listen and do. So they, in a sense, are like the first son. And Jesus then says, the second son is like you, who play lip service to doing all this, but your actions say something different. As I've thought about that, and I'm mulling over this, and I'm not exactly sure, I haven't really made up my mind about this one way or the other, but this is the thought process that I'm having, that both sons actually disrespected their father. One by his the way he speaks to him, he disrespect. I'm going to back up. Fourth commandment: honor your father and mother. It's right there in the Big Ten. The first son says no. His father tells him to do something, and he says no. So even though he actually ends up doing it, and his actions then do that, he still disrespected the father. On the flip side, the second son, who says, okay, I'll do what you're asking of me, and then ignores it, doesn't do it, whether intentionally or whether it's like a crime of omission because he's going to go or he tends to go and then just doesn't for whatever reason. Both of them are disrespecting the father. So this puts me in mind of the idea or the recognition that we are all flawed, that we all fall short in one way or the other. Now, oftentimes when we start thinking about parables, I think it's our default to start to go to, okay, where am I in this story? Who do I relate to in this story? And we want to think, well, maybe I'm like the first son because he's apparently the good son, the one who has his right actions, even if what he says is wrong or is bad. But they both disrespect their father, and in one way or the other, they both break the fourth commandment. So what do we take from that? Do we take from that the two options that are present for us, neither one are good? That maybe from a certain point of view, one is better than the other, but that they're both flawed? Maybe so. And that's kind of the thought process that I'm on. And yet, that being said, so when Jesus then takes the two sons and compares them to the religious elite on one side and the tax collectors and the prostitutes on the other side, both go into the kingdom of heaven. And that's a distinction that I kind of picked up on, just that one group goes first. Well, what does this mean to enter into the kingdom of heaven? And that's, oh Lord, that's a huge debate. That's a huge conversation. That's a huge, I don't know. There's a lot of trains of thought on that. But I always come back around, and this is just my personal thing, that when we're reminded that the kingdom of heaven has come near, that Christ has brought it near, that we can live our lives in a way that reflects the reality of the kingdom now, even though it's now and not yet. Lutheran thing. Mind blowing, I know. But so we all enter in. I come around to the idea that Christ is drawing all people to himself. And so does that mean that, okay, so the actions of the tax collectors and the prostitutes, the ones who shouldn't get it and yet do, so when they listen, when they believe, when they are changed by the presence of the Spirit within them, does that mean that they are now entering into the reality of the kingdom, the now of the now and not yet, before the religious elite who say all the right things and pay lip service but don't actually live it, don't actually believe it? Is that what Jesus is saying here? And I think so, but there can certainly be some interpretation there that I don't know. But Jesus does say they will enter before you, which seems to indicate that the bad ones are going to enter as well. It's just going to happen later. It's going to happen differently. It's going to happen in a different way. I don't know. I don't know exactly how to interpret it, but that's kind of the thought that I have, that we're all invited in, and some will go, some will begin to live their lives in a reality that reflects the kingdom of heaven sooner. I don't know. I'm trailing off because I think I'm kind of running out of thoughts. But this is the direction that my brain is going in terms of the sermon. Now, clearly, I still got more mental work to do back here before I start typing away and getting it written. But that's kind of the direction that I'm going with this. So if you have thoughts, questions, comments, by all means, throw them down in the comment section. We'll continue the conversation that way. Otherwise, I hope you have a blessed week, and we will catch you next time.